Welcome to First Answers. This is episode 15 in the series, Parent Leadership for 21st Century Children. For 21st century children to succeed, they need parents that understand the threats to their growth. Learn the 15 threats that impact your teens so you can adapt your parenting appropriately during this stage and make this time as great as it can be. Visit firstanswers.com to find more about the podcast and tons of resources for families and mental health.
In this episode, having to do with adolescence, episode 15 in this series, I want to give focus to the idea that there are some real threats to adolescent healthy development, some that are so significant and predatory that we ought to know more than we do about them. But the reason for doing that is to also point out that during this period of time, you strengthen your family and you have family meetings and teach things and become conversant, and you strengthen your relationship with your kids because you know, whether you know in detail the threats they will face, that they are going to face some. And so these threats can be successfully managed if you help your children learn how to grow and develop themselves. Now, there are quite a few religious families, for example, who have been teaching their children religious values and principles, doctrines, and, commandments. And quite often these commandments and their attitudes and the doctrines that are behind them turn out to be important guidelines for children. And I've left that out of the conversation till today so that I could give emphasis to the time that what is important about all of these religious activities, both at home and at church, has to do with this one idea: helping these beliefs and doctrines make sense to the children in the world in which they live. You just can't, nowadays, you just can't give a flat out set of lessons and hope all the children get it exactly the same way, because they're different. Their minds are different, their emotions are different from one another, because we established that during the period where we're hunting for uniqueness, so you can learn how your kids do differ. But in this case, where we're talking about adolescent children, we want to present important ideas like your religious values and beliefs in a way that makes sense to your kids. And I'd like to talk just a few minutes about how to do that. So, for instance, let's suppose that you took a religious term like faith, and then you defined it and talked about what it means. And then you said to a child, what does it look like when a person demonstrates faith? What are some examples of that? Then you also said, do you have any stories or accounts where people demonstrated faith? Then you had a conversation about how to develop faith and how it's lost. And you explained how faith is generated and faith in God and why that's important. And then if you want as a family, you may want to actually engage in some family activities that are related to that. And then, in addition, you have to have this conversant, or it would be great if you had this conversant relationship with your children so you could ask them about what in their daily activities or their lives actually allow them to see and understand how faith is important to them. Taking a test, making decisions where they're uncertain about certain outcomes, asking in prayer for help about something they want to learn or overcome or something like that. When we are able to involve ourselves and they see an example of parents doing the same thing, then what you're teaching seems to make sense to them. Now, I'll give you the reason why I think this is so important is because I think, having spent a lot of time with adolescent children in a counseling relationship, which allows me to become personally and intimately acquainted with what they think and feel and do, I've learned that a lot of the world in which they live do not present to them something that is easy to understand. In fact, the idea that there are a lot of isms or a lot of contradictory ideas is so true and so startling once you become acquainted with it. And then when you begin to see the effects of that, it's just remarkable. I cannot count the number of kids I've spent time with who friends decided that they were not male or female, or that certain kind of chemicals, even marijuana, is not all that harmful or addictive, or how certain kinds of sexual content on Snapchat is not destructive, and that they're going along participating or looking or so on without realizing how truly controlling or addictive these kinds of experiences are. I present to you, therefore, an urgent message that in your case it is important to understand the threats your adolescent children face and expose yourself to them just a little so that you know what the effects are on your kids. I've watched on the news, for example, parents reading scurrilous and vulgar book literature to school boards, and then the school board says, no, stop, this is not a place to tell that, and then the parent will say, well, then why is this information in the library in our schools? If it's too bad here, it's too bad there. And they make a really good point, but it's interesting how difficult it is for people to make choices in the world, the legal world, where free speech is used on both sides of the coin, and other kinds of legal issues or social issues are brought to bear to justify even the worst forms of things. So here's the deal. I'm going to explain to you some of the most common threats that exist for adolescent children that are threats to their healthy development. And some will be familiar, and so I'm just doing it with a proviso that if I tell you, then you'll say, okay, I'm going to learn more about how potentially harmful this is for my children. Number one, because of technology, which almost all adolescents have grown up with, great value is placed on things being fast, and the faster the better. For many young people, this affects their friendships, their social contacts, and thinking they are to be temporary. Now think about that. This is fast. We go through it really fast. Oh, a friendship doesn't last. So they don't do the things to build solid friendships quite often. And it's an amazing thing that comes from technology. And so quite often they'll grow up during this period of time and run through a variety of people without forming solid connections. Number two, because social and personal pressures have multiple layers, some individuals isolate themselves from others, which can show up as selfishness or feeling victimized or social anxiety and depression rather than learning responsibility and feeling concerned about others. It's amazing to me what the percent of individuals of our youth seem to have those experiences. Most work through them, turn out to be really remarkable and marvelous, like I've said. But in my practice, I see way too many individuals like that. Young people today are faced with a variety of gender identities to choose from. And because identifying is now part of the adolescent culture, many young people are confused. They're experimenting and transitioning from one gender to another, and later find that such an approach is abortive, and they would rather live a binomial life or either male or female. Everybody should have an opportunity to talk with some individuals thinking about being a trans man or a trans woman, but also it would help if we had a chance to talk with somebody who's done that for a while and then have discovered that the effects were irreversible, and now they're going to have to live with having had surgery. It's like a light goes out in their eyes and hope diminishes to the point where I don't know what to do with myself. So I can hardly stand the idea that some school or some school teacher would say, no, we're going to help your child, deal with his identity and not going to tell you and not allowing you to know about it. I cannot think of anything more evil or destructive than that unless the parent is just wholly incompetent. But few parents actually are. The next threat, the future looks foreboding to a lot of kids, hopeful about others, and some individuals retain their adolescent behavior and personality for many years because of it, and they are known as, say, Peter Pans. These are boys, or boys who do not grow up, or girls who don't grow up and they're still in their mid-20s or early 30s, treating people as if they're just a tangent in their lives, and they don't have to grow up and assume responsibility for anything. I've heard way too many answers to the question, well, what do you get out of your work? Well, I work so I can drink. Well, what else do you do with your money? Well, not much. Pay my rent and so on. Heard too many of those. Here's another one. Many adolescents deal with the confusion of life by deciding to drift along, which means they don't make commitments or achieve or progress. I can't count, and I wouldn't know the percents, but I think it's a sizable percent of adolescent youth who don't go to school, don't do their homework, think that sort of sloughing through stuff is easy for them. And this drifting process for both males and females is a tragedy in terms of unused potential and talent. Here's another one. Relaxed standards about sexual behavior, and therefore adolescents believe they have much greater sexual freedom without consequence. So much so that for many young people, sexual activity becomes part of their adolescent script, which means that individuals think that being sexual is part of growing up. And if you haven't been sexual, then you're just immature or dumb. Now, many young people, high school students, sophomores and juniors and seniors, have multiple sexual partners while young without appreciating that such activity makes it difficult to trust intimate relationships with others, including prospective spouses. Individuals who attempt to delay sex until later might be ridiculed, as I've mentioned. Now, I want to introduce something, say, for us to pay attention to. Well, what do you do about this? Do you think I'm being too negative? Well, I have been involved in research, for example, learned from it that a very high percent of the parents don't know what their children are involved with. I've also been involved on a practical clinical basis where the children don't communicate about things and they're often very serious, and parents do not know about those. A lot of it has to do with the internet and sex, or the internet and drugs. I also want to clearly acknowledge that I've spent a lot of time in a variety of settings with the young people who are not doing this, who are, I've said, amazing to me and remarkable, some of the most wonderful individuals I know. I have been a faculty member at Brigham Young University, and I think that's like a lot of other universities in that the freshmen and sophomore students who come are sort of the finality of how what parents are going through, and so they're at the conclusion. So you can look at these young people and say, well, how are we doing as a generation of parents? And by far, a large majority of parents are being wonderful, and so are the kids. But there is a but. And that is that it is true, clearly true, research and so on, that demonstrates that the incidence of problems and problems that children have are increasing, not decreasing. In the last 2 decades, the percent of individual youth who have alternate sexual identities has increased, doubled. And that can't simply be because they didn't dare come out. It has to do also with the fact that there are conditions in our culture, including home and so on, that make it likely for us to not promote gender identity as well as we could. Now, here's another thing that I'd like to mention. Ideological absolutism, which is called dogmatism in the psychological world, there are ideologies that are so powerfully communicated and propagated, and therefore disagreement is not met with discussion, but with ridicule, rejection, or removal. And then I would like to point out the consequence of that. The divisions that are occurring between us on the basis of ideology seem to be growing firmer and more rigid. And so instead of there being able to talk over differences and accept the good things in one side and the other, we still are having things which say, no, what you believe is not right, and what I believe is, and then we have arguments over it. Be sure and talk with your children about what ideologies exist at school, what biases are, what the teachers' biases are, and have them take a look at what they want as their opinions from what they do not want. Here's the next thread. Different genders are having very different types of experiences. For example, 60% of the girls admit to feeling depressed and anxious to the point it disrupts their lives. 30% have considered suicide, and 14% have been forced to have sex. 14% of the girls in American society report they have been forced to have sex. A higher percentage of boys commit suicide than girls. And according to this research, this is because boys feel more intense feelings about loss of relationships and greater confusion about future possibilities. It is also true that a growing percentage of young people are the children of parents in conflict and/or children of divorced or divorcing parents. This experience can result in cynicism about relationships and real difficulty in forming intimate relationships with others when they're old enough to date and to find mates. And then further, when there is tension in a child's family over time, a child will close down his or her emotions off so as not to feel them. And so they become so externally oriented, they don't have the basis of their inner self-knowledge to help make decisions. Well, here's the problem with that. Moral choices are inner choices. Some of the best choices for our success come from within us, like some invention or some idea, and so on. And children's lives can be so threatening from the outside that they train themselves to be defensive and protective about them, and then often do not spend the time or the opportunity to learn for themselves. Well, here's another one, another threat. In a culture where many have adaptable relative code of moral conduct, many young people do not have fully formed concepts of morality during adolescence, and sometimes long afterward. They often think they have no responsibility toward moral choices because it's not my problem. Large numbers of them. There are also large numbers who are careful and willing to serve and sacrifice for others. But like I mentioned, there are quite a few and an increase in numbers who just don't care. Another threat has to do with excessive use of electronics. We've learned that excessive use can delay brain growth and create impulsivity right at the time when deliberating and thoughtfulness are usually required to make complex and far-reaching decisions. Well, what else happens? Well, if your brain growth is delayed, then children are faced with tasks of their chronological age for which their mental age is no longer prepared. And so they were being asked to say, here, make this decision, and they make some really poor ones. So here's another threat. Awareness of our social environment can lead young people to discouragement and hopelessness about their future. This loss of hope can lead to withdrawal, laziness, and indifference. Many young people I've met in my clinic do not trust their emotions or as a source of knowledge for themselves and reject any subjective or emotional conclusion. That is, I just feel like I know this is right. They don't have that. Or I believe what I'm hearing is wrong for some reason, and I'd like to talk about that. Now, I've gone over today the idea that there are threats which we need to become acquainted with. I've described what the literature says are the 15 most threatening environmental experiences available to teenagers. There's one that I haven't, and it has to do with parents who are not effective leaders, who are mean or harsh with their children, excessively controlling, excessively permissive, who humiliate their kids or get into fights with them, yell a lot. These are one of the threats also that adolescent children experience. We need, in my opinion, to take a good hard look and understand the threats that exist in their environment so that we can help them be more successful and effective during this crucial period of their lives.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the Podcasts app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.